And we are live here on the RIS Picks YouTube channel for the wild card recap and divisional round betting lines opening reaction to everybody listening on the podcast feed, whether it is Sunday evening or Monday morning. Hopefully your evening or day are off to a fantastic start. Appreciate everybody for stopping by and coming in. Sure, many more folks are going to join in as they get the notification as we get rolling. As always, leave the questions and comments on the right side in the live chat as we go. I'll get to them one by one as we pull them up on the screen and talk through everything in what was almost the conclusion of the Super Wildcard weekend, as we have the game tomorrow on a neutral field between the Rams and the Vikings. A little bit to look forward to as well that we'll talk about here on the show. For those of you joining after the fact, maybe on YouTube or on the podcast, I'll have the timestamps down on the timeline as well as in the description. So if you want to jump ahead and skip the recap and get to the games and my thoughts on the opening lines, you can do that down in the timeline to jump ahead for everything that you can look forward to. Mr. Cat says, first time being up late enough to catch the live. Welcome in to your first live stream. Appreciate you stopping by. Danny Liano says, great Sunday night game. Indeed it was. For many, we'll see. Not me. Dogs 2-2, unders 3-1. What was the one under that didn't come through? That was a frustrating one, to say the least, as we lost on the Houston LA Chargers under 42.5 as the release for the week. That was gruesome, Danny. I'm not going to lie. That was as painful of a loss on a total. Since Christmas Day with that Chiefs-Steelers overs. Two brutal losses on totals down the stretch for us. Danny says, pick the winner of the game, and the spread doesn't come into play in the playoffs. Danny, we can't go down this path here on the live stream. We can't do it. There are so many things that are misleading with this statement, and I see it every year. And this isn't criticism. This isn't trying to come off condescending or anything. There's always this stat, and its references, the point spread only matters in 80% of the games. What about the other 20%? It's 20% where it matters. It matters in 100% of the games if you're trying to pick it. So this idea that, if it was as easy as you're laying it out to be, a lot of people would have success. Obviously, there's not a discrepancy between the point spread and the money line from the pricing perspective, and only matters when they win is a good after-the-fact comment. But I think it's probably one of the most misleading things that gets brought up in sports betting. Noah asks, is the RAS record really as bad as people are saying it is on Twitter for the season in NFL? If you want to look at what was given out on the service, what is tracked by the website, what is tracked by subscribers, what is tracked by BetStamp as well, the third-party service that tracks all the wagers. The overall season, including free plays, which are 0-3, is 46, 40-2, 54%. Paid plays, you can add 3 more wins to that and take away 3 losses for the paid subscriptions. And so there are a lot of people reading headlines. There are a lot of people reading tweets of a record going around that is very misleading in many ways. And then there is the reality that people who care to take more than a few seconds to look at will see. Now, obviously, down the stretch, it has been disappointing with a few games that have lost in pretty painful fashion. But for the paid service, right at 55% win rate for the season. A couple more questions coming in. Mikey B is pumped about the Eagles. David McCarthy is on my side of things. Tough watch on that Baker fumble, certainly. Now, we'll talk about the Commanders as we get into some of the games and we start looking back, and we'll talk about some of the other comments that are coming in as well. The Washington Commanders are the luckiest team of any NFL team that anybody watching this live stream have seen in any of the years that you guys have been alive, and any of us will ever see as long as we live. The things that the Commanders get away with on a weekly basis are like nothing that has ever happened in the NFL before. It's incredible to watch. Third downs for the season, they're 4th best. 4th downs, no NFL team has converted more 4th downs in history. No NFL team has ever scored a higher percentage of their points on drives that include a 4th down conversion than the Washington Commanders. And tonight we saw it again with 4th down bailouts left, right, and all over the place as they go 4 for 6 on 4th down, above 50% on 3rd down. It is remarkable how this team continues to find ways to luck into wins late in games from 3rd and 4th down conversions. And it's part of the culture that Dan Quinn is building. It's like a Dan Campbell Jr. that we're watching on the sidelines with how he's acting, how he's instilling the culture. And it's great. Cliff Kingsbury is having a resurgence. There's a lot of positives. Obviously, Jaden Daniels has been a treat to watch all season. This offense is very fun to watch. It's a very fun team to watch, and the fans around Washington should be thrilled. But it is incredible to watch game in and game out how this team finds a way to luck into victories And tonight against the Buccaneers, just another example of that. Again, it's interesting to see it as the season has unfolded. And that fumble at the end, along with the fourth downs and the flags, it's just how the Commanders' games have gone all season long. It's pretty special for them. And now we have the two ultimate variance teams with decision-making on late downs facing off against each other in divisional weekend, coming in with the Lions and the Commanders. Other games quickly that I think worth running through. I won't spend too much time on the wild card games, just as we're looking forward to the divisional round, and we'll talk about it. Texans Chargers, again, frustrating as hell for losing that under in the fashion that it did, with the end of the first half, with the interception, with the 90-yard touchdown, with the block 2-pointer. It's like anything that could have went wrong to get that game over did, and the over tickets cash. But the big thing to me in that game is something that we talked about here on the pod a couple times, in that the Houston DBs can take over games against soft passing attacks. We saw it against Miami. We commented how the Chargers passed McConkey. There's not much there for it. And that was a defense that they just have such a willingness to make plays at the defensive back position. And we saw them completely take over that game and force Herbert into his worst game of the season, arguably one of the worst we've ever seen from him in his career. And that's what the Texans can do. I do not think they can replicate that on the road at the Chiefs, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Certainly was one that was pretty incredible. Offensively, I didn't see a lot to indicate that things are going to be changing for the Texans relative to the team that we've seen them become down the stretch as the injuries have mounted. Don't think there's a very high expectation for the offense going on the road into KC. And the next game that we saw on Saturday night, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, that Steelers defense just it ran out of the big plays in high leverage spots, and it couldn't continue forever. And we saw Rustin Pickens fall off a bit. And in that game where they fell behind, there just wasn't anything there. And even though they didn't show much chase in the final 3 to 4 weeks of the season during that losing streak, they did. They were potentially a stop away from making that game very interesting. Late third quarter, early fourth quarter, Ravens picked it up, and then Henry knocked off the big run. At least there was a bit of fight from the Steelers that we just didn't see down the stretch in the regular season. But that Steelers offense, man, but behind losing the run game and just becoming so reliant on those deep shots from Russ, there just was nothing there offensively. And that's a very good Ravens defense that was able to set that game up very comfortably for them. In terms of the games that we saw today, Buffalo against Denver, we heard it from Peyton in the post-game press conference. They fell behind early, couldn't get the run game going. The Bills were so dominant on the ground that the pass rush for Denver meant nothing. The weaknesses of the Broncos defense, aside from Surtain, were exposed. And Josh Allen was Josh Allen. That's exactly what Sean Payton summed up in the press conference. I thought the punt on fourth down from the Bills' 39 was a poor decision. I certainly thought the play calling, going run, pass, down 2 scores on the road in the playoffs into the second half, was a bizarre decision. Sean Payton, I think, deserves quite a bit of criticism for how he was coaching like the Broncos were leading in the second half, despite being trailing. I don't think it would have made a difference if he changed up what he was doing play calling wise, because the game was so out of hand at that point. But I also question his decision with Estime pregame, having him inactive and bringing him back who's been effectively off the field for 2.5 months and trying to make him the lead guy. Everything that I was reading up to the game was talking about how the gap scheme against the Bills defense and Estime fitting into that role for the Broncos was a good advantage for Denver. And he was ruled inactive 90 minutes prior to the game. And Peyton tried to throw a bit of a changeup in that, which I don't understand. So I think there's a lot to question about how Peyton handled that game overall. Packers, Eagles. To me, when I'm thinking about the Green Bay Packers, last year was a spark year where the team came up effectively as a bit of a surprise, certainly, and the playoff game was a surprise, but there was a lot of praise for Jordan Love and the offense and how they became very difficult to defend because they didn't have a true number 1 wide receiver. And that was viewed as like a big positive and something that made the team unique and very difficult to defend. What we saw this year was that almost became a bit of a curse for them, not having a true number 1 wide receiver in big games all season long where the Packers failed to beat top competition. They didn't have that go-to guy, and they became very run dependent. And when they fell behind and the run game wasn't working, we just saw the passing game not click at all. And obviously losing Christian Watson put them at a disadvantage coming into this game against Fangio and the Eagles defense. But not having a key number one guy, I think, is going to hurt this team and something they need to figure out in the offseason. Because in these big games against top competition, we saw when the run game can't carry you to wins, not having a number one is more detrimental than it was viewed as a positive. And this season really, I think, changed the viewpoint for me on the Packers offense as a whole. I think what they were able to do amid some of the injuries was admirable, but they have to sort that out. For the Eagles, Jalen Hurts looked rusty, I think is a fair thing to say, from the later portion of the second quarter to like early fourth quarter. Don't believe he completed a pass. I mean, that offense completely stalled out, if not for Saquon Barkley, who carried the entire offense. So that, I think, was part of the concussion lingering effects that we talked about, and how you see a passing dip and quarterbacks coming back from concussion, aside from a Lamar playoff performance, just have never looked the same and never played to their baseline. But on the other hand, Eagles didn't have to have a big game from Hurts. It's something we've seen a lot this season, where they get ahead and they can just sit on the lead and be great front runners. And without having to be pushed, we didn't see Hurts necessarily need to have a big game. And that's something that could definitely change depending on which opponent they get coming up this week. Other games that we'll talk about tonight, I guess the last one on the schedule, is I have a hair stuck in my eye that I'm trying to battle gracefully as we're on the YouTube live stream on video. We talked about Washington a bit, right? And the luck that comes with them. The fumble for Baker was an absolute killer in the fourth quarter on a simple handoff that was just a complete game-changing moment. You don't know what's coming from that drive, but the Bucs up 4 at that time, in range of covering, in range of getting a long drive, and potentially putting that game away if they can find some big plays, end up just botching that snap and giving the ball right back to Washington, who scores on the fourth down. But then equally, as we talk about things that happen in the benefit of the Commanders, 3rd and 2 from the 11 or 12 yard line, you have Bucky Irving gashing the Commanders defense down the field, and they elect to go with a fake handoff, and then Baker follows Bucky up the middle as a lead blocker. Instead of handing it off, Baker gets stuffed at the line of scrimmage, and then the Bucs botch the snap count on the next play and end up losing 3 yards on a broken play, force them to kick the field goal. I question Baker's willingness to keep that on the 3rd down. And then the 4th down is just another one of these breaks late in games that have gone the Commanders' way all season long, benefiting in their favor. And that's exactly what we saw, as the Commanders then pick up the 3rd down, march down the field, and set themselves up for the field goal that bounces in off of the upright. There's a comment here from Barry. What's up with these late steam moves? They lose at like 90%. When we think about the late steam this week, it was on the Chargers-Texans under. We also saw a little bit of Chargers money come in very late. Thinking back to the Ravens-Steelers game, the Steelers took a lot of game day money as well. That got down as low as 8.5. There was also over money that came back. In the Sunday games, the Broncos got blasted this morning when the limits were the highest. That never had a chance of covering past the second series. In the middle game, that was Eagles money that was justified and did cash in for the late moves that got as high as 5.5. And then in the game tonight, it was over money that came in steady, got as high as 51.5. Surprisingly, and that game stayed under the total. This has been something, Barry, honestly, it's been going on for the majority of the season. There are a lot of pros that are very much struggling this season and having a bad year. And it's been very odd in terms of how things have moved over the course of the week, especially late. I don't have a great answer for it. My speculation is that there's a lot of late game variance that is driving some of these results. I think there's also a willingness from the biggest groups to hide a lot of their potential CLV from positions that they take, just given the state of the industry. That is much easier said than done when it comes to the NFL with the limits that exist for it. But that's certainly something that we're seeing in other sports. And I think earlier in the week, too, with the NFL, we're seeing a lot of manipulation. And so rather than it being something that's dumped off late, it's more perhaps positions being taken at different time that's changing how some of these lines are moving. It is a very unusual year that I haven't seen in 17 years doing it. So there's a lot of questions that I have to look back once the season is done, and there's a little more time to see like what was actually going on and what was moving and what the results were. But subjectively, sitting here, it feels very, very different for sure. Joe English says, we'll be in Vegas this weekend. What is the schedule for this week's live streams? Doing one right now. I'll do another one Wednesday night, Joe. And that'll be uploaded here on YouTube as well as Apple and Spotify. So keep an eye out for that in notifications as well as on the podcast feed. If you're watching and you've enjoyed the live streams, you've enjoyed the shows, and you want to make sure you don't miss it, the subscribe button is down below. You can hit it if you think you're subscribed. Take a second and double check. You might not be. Just make sure that subscribe button is hit. It's free to subscribe. You'll get the notifications for when the show goes live, so you and everybody will not miss everything. If you're enjoying the shows and you are subscribed, there's a thumbs up button down below. Would appreciate if you have a second to do it as well. Jordan says, Team Adam, do your thing. Love the sports knowledge and stats. That's why I come here. Appreciate it as well. Good to have you stopping by. Before we get into looking ahead to the games coming up in Divisional Weekend, Michael B. says, is Sam Darnold going to have a repeat heinous performance? What an adjective. Heinous, Michael B. On a Sunday night, pulling it out in the YouTube chat. I'm surprised the game's not 3 is my initial stance on this. I thought we would see 3 after the game was moved. I did the Jason McIntyre podcast, and when I joined the stream, he was on the phone with a retired NFL quarterback on speaker, and it was talking back and forth, and it was mentioned that the game was going to be moved before it was official. So I was sitting there looking at the line, and it was trending down a little bit. The Rams were taking money for the entire week, and it was at around 1. And I'm like, okay, it's going to get moved. It should reopen 3, because I think the Rams home field matters a little bit. I think the Vikings fans travel as well as any fans not named Buffalo or Pittsburgh, perhaps, in the NFL. So it was going to be a good Minnesota contingent in LA, but I think that's still going to be the case in Arizona. But just by virtue of the game being moved, I'm surprised it didn't get to 3. Now, that didn't answer your question about Sam Darnold. I don't think that Darnold's performance on Sunday night against the Lions was as heinous as being described. He did not perform well. He missed a ton of throws. It's not an indictment, in my opinion, of the Vikings offense, because 10 overthrows were overthrows that just missed big plays and touchdowns and opportunities. This wasn't Herbert and the Chargers against the Texans. When you look at the output of offense for the Vikings, this was just a lot of near misses and bad throws from Darnold, who had his worst game of the season. I don't think it looks as bad as it did and being labeled to be against the Rams on Monday night. Now, is there enough in that and looking at this number to bet? I don't think so at the current price, and I haven't done anything with it. But I think that was more near misses than it was just disaster for the Vikings. And so that's my take on it. Rudy's given some positivity along with Sean, saying don't beat yourself up for the rough losses. I mean, these 2 totals have been ridiculous. So that is good. John, I'm not going to get into that record specifically and what is being posted. There were 4 weeks that were front-loaded with losses due to different segments that were counting very long shot props and futures as losses. I don't have the energy to address it for anybody who takes it seriously and is viewing that as truth relative to what's tracked on BetStamp and the service, which I put every minute that I'm awake into. I don't know what to say if people can't see through that. And I know on Twitter, it's a lot of headline reading, and people like to jump on things and run with it. And there's folks that are trying to pile on with that, but it takes a few minutes to look past it to see what is going on. Not only is that, but there's several bets that were never even mentioned. There's other ones that were 20, 30 yards off of what was quoted. I mean, it's not something that I'm going to take or address, but it is what it is. Let's get to the games coming up. There's a lot of questions trashing McVay, which is intriguing. A couple other ones talking about some of the games this past day. It sounds like I'm jumping the gun, but give me Daniels over all NFC quarterbacks. He's mobile and accurate. All of them. Man, that's a big statement. I don't know if I'm that optimistic about it. Let's hit the brakes a little bit on that. Something I want to throw in the chat. There's 250 people in here. I'm curious about it. I was having a text message back and forth with a group of other bettors as well. Here's a question for you guys. Would you prefer to go back to the old playoff system where the top two teams got a bye and then we had the 4 wildcard games, or do you prefer it as it is with the 7 teams and just the one team getting the bye and the extra extended super wildcard weekend? I'd love to know what you think. 2 stances that I've heard on it. I don't dislike the idea of going back to the old playoff format. I don't hate it. The thing that was lobbed my way is getting rid of divisions when it comes to the scheduling, and you end up playing a schedule based on your record from the previous season to eliminate the barriers of divisions and have it so you're not playing 6 games of your season against the same 3 teams. So do you prefer going on with this NFL as it is constructed now, or do you go back to what it was and remove divisions? I think it's a fun question to talk about as we see these 7-2 matchups just basically become irrelevant. Packers the only team to win, and these other 7-2s are just absolute beatdowns. So curious to know what you think in the chat. We'll get to those as we go. All right, games coming up. Divisional weekend. I'm expecting Houston KC to be the early game. If it's been announced, please let me know. I would think that we see Washington Detroit Saturday night, then we'll see Baltimore Buffalo Sunday night, and then we'll get LA Minnesota at Philly Sunday afternoon. I think that's the schedule we're going to see. There's schedule experts in the chat. Let me know if that's true or not. Houston at KC. Chiefs 7.5-point favorites with a total of 42.5. The big question that I have in my mind, how do you grade the Chiefs offense? Because I think there's a real school of thought here that you're throwing out a lot of the regular season. Brown is in. Hopkins is in. Kelsey is well rested. The O-line is well rested. The backs are well rested. Mahomes, who was dealing with the ankle injury, talking about how these extra time off by getting the 1 seed was going to be a relief for the team, give him a chance to reset. He was doing that the week after he was injured. He's going to be 100%. How much does this all matter? You have all of the past Andy Reid bye stuff. I think there's an element of not really knowing what the Chiefs offense is going to be coming into this game, which is a fair question to ask. The Chiefs in their playoff history with Patrick Mahomes have had some phenomenal performances, and we've seen a ratcheted level of play up once we get into the playoffs. And it's kind of like, okay, all the restrictions are off. We're getting all the great plays that we can, and we're going all out. In the playoffs, the Chiefs have been in the Mahomes era running an offense that is averaging 6.25 yards per play, which is an obscenely high amount of yards per play. What is this offense going to look like with everybody healthy, with extra time to rest, to get right, and to have extra time to install? I don't think anybody knows. And I think that there is this idea about Kansas City that they can't score and they can't put up big numbers and they can't cover point spreads. And there's sort of an unwillingness to lay the number with the Chiefs. Even in the latter portion of the season, not counting the Denver game, there's been an unwillingness to lay the number with the Chiefs when it's more than a field goal. And that's a very real sentiment that is being shared. And we're now above a touchdown. And I think there's going to be a bit of divisiveness in this in terms of how the Chiefs are viewed. And there's potential upside here, I think, with the offense that probably isn't being priced in yet and might not be this week or next week as we try to figure out exactly how great this Chiefs offense can be because everybody's back, rested, and healthy. Defensively, there's a question of what type of elevated play might we get with Jalen Watson coming back. The loss of Watson earlier in the season was a killer. And the big liability for the middle chunk of the season for the Chiefs defense was their cornerback depth. When you were throwing to 3/4 of the field, you were getting a matchup advantage for most teams with the offense. You put Watson back on the field, who is going to be there on Saturday. I mean, that's a massive boost to the Kansas City Chiefs defense. It's not going to have Jamari Connor just in bad situations. It's going to give Trent McDuffie a bit of relief as the number 1 corner. And Johnson and Williams take a bit of a relief as well. So I think the return of Jalen Watson is a big boost for the Chiefs defense, pardon me. And the Chiefs offense is kind of a team that I think is going to be very difficult to price. Now, for the Houston Texans, their defense with these DBs, they can take over games. Are they going to be able to do that against this aforementioned Chiefs offense? I don't think so. I think this is night and day comparison to what they faced with the Chargers, who were a one quarterback, one wide receiver team. This is going to be a Chiefs game where not only are you getting probably a good amount of plays that we just haven't seen during the regular season, but you now just have a wealth of weapons for Patrick Mahomes to work with that makes this offense quite versatile. And so I think that's a negative for the Texans defense. Now, Texans offensively, I think the path is pretty narrow for Houston as well. I mean, even against the LA Chargers, who I think defensively were incredibly overrated coming into that game based on the schedule they faced during the regular season. But the Texans were not a step up in class at all. And even in that game, it wasn't like we were seeing just dominant Texans offensive performance. They topped 6 yards per play for the first time, but it was aided by some explosive plays, especially in the rush game, which was something I think was a bit of a surprise to many watching against the Chargers, whose rush defense metrics looked really good on the season. But the big weakness in the past years for the Chiefs defense was typically against the run. But this year they have been much improved against the run, and they've been able to maintain that all season long. So I think this is a obviously much more difficult matchup for the Texans. When it comes to the number, beyond just the sentiment of, like, can the Chiefs cover big numbers and win by margin and cover and win by double digits, and on all the thought processes that go into that, these two teams obviously played a couple of weeks ago, and it was Kansas City -3.5. We're out to 7.5. Home field advantage in the playoffs matters. You're getting a bump for that. Rest, it matters, especially for the Chiefs, who talked about how important it was. So there's a bump for that. And then I think just matchup-wise, with the uncertainty that we're getting from both sides and the likely improved offense and defense for the Chiefs and guys coming back, you're getting a boost for that well. So there's a lot of different ways that I see the Chiefs upgraded. And I don't know, like, is 7.5 going to be a number that entices enough money to come in and hold this number or take it back? I don't know if that's the case, especially hearing some of the top guys at sportsbooks talk about some of the teasers and the alt parlays that come in. I don't know who's running to bet Houston at 7.5 in this game. And so perhaps we see this push up a little bit further, and the total is an interesting number to see as well, given some of those offensive improvements that could be coming for the Chiefs. But do you get anything from the Texans offense? I'm not sure. Rudy says, Chiefs D better than Chargers D. Absolutely, especially with Watson back. I don't think that's a discussion, really. Mike A says, maybe Texans to cover in the first half, Chiefs second half. If you don't like the big number on the Chiefs, it's tough for me to get to, Mike, if I'm being honest. Rudy, I saw Jets fan. You're a Jets fan. You went through this for 20 years with Brady. You know what happens. They smoke everyone once the playoffs start. Who are you referring to? I know with the Jets, but Rudy, what's the other team you're mentioning there? Pardon me if I'm saying the name wrong. Aloam Hall? If I'm saying that wrong, please correct me. Spags will limit the Texans to 10 to 16 points. Chiefs will score at least 20, coming off rest and watching everybody else. Jared Trier says, I don't think that's the same concerns. Maybe they start slow, but I feel like somehow they will just end up with 30 plus. Lots of bullish concerns on the Chiefs offense. Mike A is asking about, does it concern you at all that they haven't played in almost a month? Some teams, perhaps. Chiefs with Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes, no, especially considering how they were talking about needing it and how they were talking about wanting to have the rest to get everybody healthy and get everybody right. So I don't think that's a concern in this game. I'll talk about this one, even though I think it's out of order. And again, I don't have the schedule in front of me, but I'm guessing Washington-Detroit is going to be the Saturday night game. But we'll stick in the AFC. Baltimore on the road at Buffalo. Pick 'em 51.5. I posted like initial thoughts videos, and this one got like 100,000 views on TikTok, and then on YouTube it's done pretty good numbers as well relative to other shorts. And the big point of contentment and criticism in the video was that I didn't explicitly reference that the Buffalo Bills in the first meeting, who got bullied up front, were without Bernard, Teron Johnson, and Matt Milano in that game. Now, I didn't feel that it was necessarily like needed to bring that up, as it was more of like a reaction and a look ahead to this matchup specifically. But I think that's a fair point to start, because it's going to be a talking point that gets brought up a lot. What I will say about Matt Milano specifically, who's kind of the guy, I'm reading a lot of Bills forums and a lot of Bills community, that's the guy who's being referenced a lot for not being in the lineup for the first matchup against the Ravens. And a lot of Bills fans thinking that he was going to make the difference being back in the lineup. Matt Milano, since returning from injury, has graded out as linebacker number 162 in the NFL. The drop-off from his play that he has put on the field versus Williams has been significant. And I think in this matchup specifically, Bills would be better off with more Williams on the field relative to how Milano has played. Now, initial film reviews from the game against the Denver Broncos, who were trying to go run heavy and trying to dictate the line of scrimmage, was that Milano was playing better than he has since returning from injury. Now, it's not a massive snap volume that we have seen from him, and obviously his on-off splits that precede this season are massive when you look at his performance when he's on the field and the Bills' performance defensively without him. It hasn't been the same guy this season coming back from the injury. I think it's very hard to argue that he is. Now, when I think about that first matchup, could you make the case that Teron Johnson being on the field could have made a difference in that game? Perhaps. Could you make the case that Matt Milano being on the field would have made a difference for that game? Perhaps. Terrell Bernard? Perhaps. Like, I get the sentiment for it. Let's not forget how big of a beatdown that was at the hands of the Baltimore Ravens in that first meeting. I mean, that was a complete demolition from start to finish. And the problem is for the Bills is that they're undersized and have to dedicate more bodies against the run when they're actively trying to stop the run. The Baltimore Ravens welcome that with the 12 and 22 personnel that they play, the different looks that they can employ, as well as utilizing the two tight ends in the passing game, which they have bookending the line of scrimmage. And Ricard just becomes the ultimate chess piece. And this is just like a dream matchup for Todd Monken and this Ravens offense in a Bills defense to face. And it wasn't necessarily a scheme or a personnel disadvantage that the Bills has. It's just schematic. Like it's just a physical mismatch that I don't even think the Bills with those guys back can contain consistently. And so what I think the Bills are going to have to do in this game is completely sell out against the run. Like, it's got to be an all-out sellout to stop the run. And they have to hope that it forces the Ravens into passing more than expected, and they can just hang on and not allow the big explosive plays and find ways to get off the field and let the offense do what it's been doing the last few games down the stretch. I think it has to be an all-out sellout. Now, what's intriguing is Sean McDermott in his career has been able to put together some big curveball game plans when the stakes are the highest that opposing offenses don't see coming. And there's been so much time to think about that first matchup that I'm not willing to just concede that this game is going to play out in the same manner. I don't think the Bills, even with those guys back, have enough just to set up and win that battle against this Ravens front and that ground game at the rate that it is playing at. I don't think that's possible. But I'm not going to put anything past McDermott of being able to come up with a game plan that throws them off guard early and just gives the Bills offense enough of a chance to get ahead, like they did with the Lions in that game, who, quite frankly, run a similar run game scheme to what the Ravens are going to do, but at a lesser level. But that is a very talented Lions offensive line and a very elite Lions run game. And the Bills were able to take it out early and get ahead and hang on in what became a shootout, which this game could certainly turn into. Weather-wise, this is going to be cold on Sunday night, if this is in fact scheduled for Sunday night as I'm going through. If someone knows the schedule, let me know. 25 degrees Fahrenheit, not accounting for the wind chill. So it's going to be cold. Again, when you get these cold weather games, 5 to 8% drop in passing is what we see for forecasts like this. But both of these teams probably going to be very willing to run the football. A couple other things that I just kind of think about this game as we look down the stretch. So past the Rams-Lions for the Bills schedule, it has gone Pats, Jets, Pats, where everybody sat, and then Broncos with a rookie quarterback making his first start on the road. My counterpoint to a lot of this Bills defense is not only are the numbers misleading season long and how they fared against the run, but in terms of just opposing offenses they faced down the stretch, it's been as soft as it gets when you think about those offenses that they faced and the scenarios that they faced them in. I think that's something to consider if we're looking at perhaps a little bit of an overrated Bills defense as a whole. But I want to caveat that with the Ravens and a lot of the numbers that they have defensively. So week 12 was the turning point in the news that we heard from reporters and team analysts for how the team was changing around. We saw Marlon Humphrey moved. We saw Kyle Hamilton moved back to a safety spot. And the Ravens sense are the number one defense in the NFL from an EPA per play perspective. But think about the Ravens down the stretch. New York Giants, Pittsburgh Steelers, Houston Texans, Cleveland Browns, Pittsburgh Steelers. It's been a very easy schedule of opposing offenses for this Ravens defense down the stretch for the last month and a half as well. And so we haven't seen the Ravens outside of early in games. Maybe to an extent, you might be able to point to that Steelers game, the first meeting back in earlier December that was tighter into the third quarter. But I mean, the Ravens offense hasn't been pushed and hasn't been playing in a deficit in a very long time. And so I think that matters too when you think about some of these Ravens totals, some of these Ravens defensive metrics and how much they have improved, how much it's benefited them. And so, like, what is this Ravens team going to look like when they're really pushed in a playoff game? And certainly we've seen the Bills at times pushed in the last 2 months, and it's been incredibly difficult to stop. And the way that this Bills run game has been coming together and the way that they leaned on the run game against the Broncos, I think is a much different aspect of this team that didn't exist earlier in the season when these two teams met way back in September as well. So that's another thing that I think is different for this matchup too. The Ravens have taken the early money in this game. It's now down at pick. I have a hard time seeing the Ravens as a favorite in this game on the road at Buffalo. I don't think I could get comfortable in that. And so early money's been on the Ravens. But again, like, this was 1.5. And I think about it's just how some of these guys who are in charge of sportsbooks have been talking about trying to straddle some of these numbers that are getting teased and the alt lines that come with it. And I think that has something to do with the initial move, at least partially, as we see these other games open as well. And this game opened right at the same time that we got the Chiefs game, which was right in that same window. And so I think that's leading into this a little bit as well. So I can't get to the Ravens being favored on the road. I just can't do it. Lots of questions coming in the chat. There's some good ones as well. Let's hit some questions here before we get to the one NFC game, and then we'll speculate on what we're going to get from the other games coming up as well. There was a question from Michael Fozard, who's been watching shows and following the podcast and hanging out for a very long time, but I lost it in the feed. He's saying, hope the move meant well. The move has not happened yet. I was asked yesterday on Forward Progress. The only reason I haven't been talking or mentioning anything about it besides it happening. So the wife and I built our first home. It's the first time we've owned a home. We went through the building process. As you can imagine, between me doing what I do on the betting side and my wife being a new to Canada citizen, the bank process has been a complete whirlwind. And so I've been kind of like expecting the worst along the way. But just last Friday, we signed the final papers. It went through and it is done. And so wife and I are moving back to Saskatoon, where I'm from, back in Saskatchewan, where we're setting up home for the first time ever and finally locking in. And so we're very excited for that, but it's not happened yet. We're going to be moving after the Super Bowl, but we get to see it coming up in 2 weeks for the first time. So it's going to be a blind reveal as we're out here on the West Coast at the moment, but it'll be good to finally have a home and be settled up in one place. So that's why I've been kind of not talking about it or spoiling it. I'm just with the bank stuff, I always expect the worst, just because in the past, when your income is coming from the sources that it is, it's been very difficult to get a lot. So now that it's finally done, a bit of an exhale in what has been a very stressful 4 to 5 months. So that's what's going on and that's what's happening. But The Wednesday after divisional weekend coming up, we get to see it. And then possession is right after the Super Bowl as well. So exciting times for us. And that's where we're at with that. Questions that came in on this one. Mr. Hall. And again, pardon me if I said the first name incorrectly. This is the game Lamar could put the league on notice from an elite passing perspective. If the Ravens win, they have a great chance of beating the Chiefs. I agree with the first part. I think it's long deserved for Lamar and how great of a pocket passer he's been, especially this year. It's been incredible. And so I think that part has always been underappreciated by the media and just bettors in general. So I agree with the first part. In terms of the second part of that, I don't know if the matchup is as great against the Chiefs as being labeled, with how much the Chiefs' run defense has improved and some of the improvements we might see defensively coming out of the secondary as well. So I agree with the first part, not the second part. Lots of defense for him in the regular season and how it looks. And here we go. We still question Lamar from the pocket, rightfully so, but the postseason and everything. I don't agree with the pocket passing criticism. And it's something I haven't agreed with for several seasons, as his numbers have really suggested the opposite. Luke saying anything past Ravens -1 is absolutely crazy. I agree with you. I am on that same sentiment as well. Brian is coming out with the coach and the clock management system. Why do coaches swim, S-W-E-M, brain dead with clock management this year? I'm guessing seam. I don't know. This was brought up a couple weeks ago too. I don't know. I will say part of it, I think, is that coaches never get credit for when they do it right. Same thing with the refs. No one's ever like, that was a great flag. I'm going to tweet about how great of a penalty call that was, and I'm going to show some support for that ref. He made a great call. You never see that. The same way you never see, man, that coach took a great timeout. I mean, he really called a great timeout in that spot. However, anyone with a cell phone is willing to go like, that was a BS call, or man, did that coach botch the end of the game? And so I think it's kind of a biased criticism, but there is a lot that should be criticism. And I think the biggest criticism is you shouldn't, in the NFL, make a wrong decision on the clock when you have all these resources to get it right. So that's the criticism to me, more so than it's happened. Rudy saying, I'd love to see the bank's face when you initially tell them. It took me, I couldn't, to put it in perspective, just because, I mean, I lived in Colombia, I lived in the Dominican Republic, I spent some time in Trinidad and Tobago. Like I worked for betting companies all over the place for a long time with a Canadian passport. Rudy, to put it in perspective, I couldn't get a credit card until I was 29 years old. And I mean, I had to use debit and cash for everything. Like, that's how tough it is in Canada. It is so hard to do anything in Canada when you're not like set up with some well-known employer that's going through everything. It's brutal. And so, yeah, it's been years in the making to try to get things right. A GS is praising Dan Quinn. There we go. Well-coached game by Dan Quinn today. The thing I like about Dan Quinn, he's consistent. I think that's a positive. I like coaches that stay consistent with what they do. I think that's why Campbell has grown into be as loved as he is, personality-wise too. I mean, everybody hated him, including myself when he first started, thought it was a joke, but he stayed consistent throughout. And I think that there's a lot of appreciation in that. Dan Quinn, in his revival, second time around here, has really done that all season long. He's been very consistent, very lucky, but very consistent. And I think that's appreciated, and that's why it's so well liked. Now, amid all these other hirings, which we're getting a little bit off the rails here, but like we just saw Mike Vrabel hired, been talking a lot and kind of discussing on the side in texts with others, talking about how when we think about coaches being hired for the second time or the second go around, is that becoming more of a valued commodity than the hot coordinator promoted to the head coach? And there's starting to be a growing amount of evidence that going with the second-time guy around looking to correct his mistakes might be the better play than trying to get the hot coordinator stepping into the head coach role. And that might be something that continues as the league progresses. But have been looking into a lot of past stats and a lot of turnarounds. We put Dan Quinn firmly in that category, who was the head coach that bumped back to the coordinator and then got the head coaching try again. And it was interesting hearing from Cliff Kingsbury a week or two ago, where he's talking about how Quinn learned so much from his mistakes the first time as a head coach and has kind of actively worked all season to correct those. And Kingsbury has said that it's kind of been an inspiration to him because it's allowed him to reflect on his time in Arizona, realize what he did wrong, and get him thinking about if he gets a head coaching role again, how he's going to do things differently. And I think that's probably something we continue to see happen often with some of these guys as the league progresses on, especially when you get the head coach back in that role who hires the right offensive coordinator. And that's going to be key for Vrabel. And that's part of the reason why, like I did a video last week that blew up talking about Rex Ryan as the head coach for the Jets and how I think that makes a lot of sense if they get the right offensive coordinator to go with them, because you get a guy like Rex who's been there and done it. And bring on all the fire and the criticism for the Jets by putting Rex in that seat, but been there, done that. If you get the right coordinator and you have Rex managing things on the side in that second go around, I think that's a much more beneficial solution than hoping that Aaron Glenn pans out at the bigger stage or any of these other 48 names that they're trying to go after. So that's an interesting thing to think about as we go down the coaching back and forth. Not sure what to make of Vrabel signing for the Pats, says GS. It's an upgrade, but not sure how big. Pats' bigger issue is their roster. Will be interesting to see their moves this offseason. They need to get a number one wide receiver, but they have draft capital. They got cap. I think they can build a good team. They have to get the right offensive coordinator. Have to do it. Have to do it. Luke says, back to the Ravens. Do you think Monken could have a slip up like last year? Interesting thought. I'll leave it at that, Luke. I'll leave it at that for now. Last game on the board that we have. LA Rams are, Washington on the road at Detroit. We have LA Rams on the road at LA or Minnesota on the road at Philadelphia. Quickly on that one. I would expect Eagles -7 against the Rams, 6.5, 7. I would expect Eagles 3.5 against the Vikings is what I would expect from that matchup. 3.5, 4, 6.5, 7 between those two. Washington on the road at Detroit. I have not seen a number for this since I came on the air. I would expect Lions -9 and a ridiculously high total. How high would I go? Would I make it Vikings high for this? Let me know in the chat what the total was for this. But I would say Lions 9 and 50, 54, 55 would be my guess on this total. This is a genuine first thought and first reaction for this. I don't know if I'll lay the number with the Lions. I really want to. And part of this, I think, is kind of, man, like I think about this Commanders offense, and it is so hard for me this year specifically, where so many of just like the easy square decisions have won. And I'm not saying that in like a detrimental way. Like there's a lot of just basic logic that could get you to a handful of wins. And I think a lot of bets have been perhaps overcomplicated, or decision-making has been overcomplicated. But this to me is just such a classic spot where you have this team that's just incredibly lucky and continuing to get all of the breaks and all of the bounces going their way. And the fact they got away with it against Tampa Bay was one thing, but like to do it again on the road against Detroit, who's effectively that at a higher level, who can just sit behind this O-line and run on you all game long, especially with Montgomery coming back. And now you have a Lions defense that obviously got healthier and was willing to just throw everything that they had in that game against Darnold in the pocket with those extra guys back. And you're throwing that at this Commanders offense, which is effectively Daniels with McLaurin on deep shots, Daniels legs, and then you have De'Ami Brown like subbing in for plays with Zach Ertz when needed. And it just seems like such a winnable matchup for this Lions defense and how they're playing at home in the playoff environment. I have a hard time seeing Washington continuing to get the bounces like they have. But at the same time, it's like, is Jaden Daniels as a rookie quarterback something that the market just can't catch up to? And that those luck metrics finally coming to a head is just something that you're paying a premium to bet against in this, which could be true. And if the season was not playing out in the way it was, and I hadn't seen some of the ways that these games have gone and how some of these lines have moved, like I feel like in any of the past seasons, this would just be not thinking about it. 8.5 with Detroit, click, submit, done. We got the Lions, and they're going to stuff the rookie quarterback on the road, and it's going to be just a downhill running attack with Dan Campbell, who never takes his foot off of the gas. And that would be it, and that would be the extent of it. This year, it just gives me pause. It really, really does. When it's a chance that we see a rookie quarterback that the market just has not caught up to at all this year. This is who the coach we just talked about, and Dan Quinn is. It's him being consistent, and you're getting a big number with a team that gambles consistently and way more often than not wins those gambles. And so they're going to be a tough team to put away and win by a significant margin, like laying 8.5 would require, even if it is a team that's going on the road. Now, like you think about the Commanders' schedule and some of these games that they've played, even in their losses, like against Dallas in a game that got ugly in a hurry, that was only Dallas by 8. The loss to Pittsburgh was a single point. The loss to Baltimore was a touchdown. So like the only time we've seen teams get outside of this margin and outside of this number against the Commanders all season was back in Daniel's debut on the road against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in week 1. Otherwise, there hasn't been a team all season, unless I'm missing something out of the top of my head, there hasn't been a team all season that has won and covered by this margin against the Washington Commanders. So is Detroit going to be the first one? I don't know. That's something that certainly comes to mind as well. I'm guessing that Washington's going to be the popular underdog of the week and get back consistently. That's how I would think that this gets bet out, but I don't know if there's nearly going to be enough money to come in to pull this number down and give that much more of a beneficial price on the Lions. So we saw the Bucks get bet immediately early at open last week from 2.5 to 3 up to 3.5. There was buyback at 3.5, but that number held at 3 all week against it. So I don't know. Stuck with that one, but certainly wouldn't be comfortable taking the points with Washington, given how they're playing out in some of these games. All right, final couple questions before we get out. Man, 4 games. The good news is that there's 7 games left. The bad news is that there's 7 games left. That's kind of how we're sitting here with the NFL season. Rudy says Detroit might put up 50 on Washington's D. Luke says, I think the defense can suffocate him as they did with Darnold, especially with that O-line. Do you truly believe Jared Goff could hoist that trophy, or is it only between 3 quarterbacks? Well, I think you're very likely to get Jared Goff or Jalen Hurts in the Super Bowl. And I think the same could probably be viewed about both of those quarterbacks. This is all or nothing for this Lions staff. I mean, Campbell knows changes are coming. Glenn knows changes are coming. Johnson knows changes are coming. They knew this was the last year, and they've been playing like it all season long. So I wouldn't say anything is hard to believe with this Lions team, the way that they're operating and the way that they are playing. I think any of the 3 likely opponents they get from the AFC, not counting Houston for obvious reasons, is going to be a bad matchup for them. So I don't know if their resistance comes in the NFC. I think it will come in that Super Bowl. Deuce says, about a month ago, you suggested Buffalo at 7-1 to win the Super Bowl was great value. Seems like you feel they are the 3rd best AFC team now. Is that correct? So preseason Super Bowl stance was Chiefs, Eagles, and then there was the ad, as you were saying, on the Bills, but it was at 6-1, not 7-1. 7-1 would have been nice. Do I think that the Bills are the 3rd best team in the AFC? I think that is a fair statement. I would say the difference between Buffalo and Kansas City or Baltimore is at most 1.5 points. And so it is very, very slim in terms of how they stack out. I think that the Bills have the weakest unit, their defense, of any of the 3 or like any of the remaining 6 units in the AFC. And I that's the reason that I would have them as the third ranked team. I think when it comes to it, they have the worst defense, the worst unit of any of the 6 that you have down the stretch. So that's why I have them third specifically. But the gap between third and first is, I think, probably as tight as I remember having 3 teams in the divisional round ever. Usually there was a bit of a bigger gap, and this year it's very, very tight, which will be intriguing. Rudy, why is that Bills-Ravens total at 51.5? Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, and 2 defenses that are potentially overrated relative to their numbers based on the strength of schedule that they have faced the last couple of weeks, and based on the fact that we really haven't seen either of these teams pushed in the second half of a game for a long time. Oh, you thought it would open higher. I thought you were going the other way with that. No, I think it's probably fair for what this game is with the cold and how these 2 teams match up. GK, this has been my worst NFL season, and it is not even close. I've had a ridiculous amount of turnovers go against me. Brutal. A lot of turnovers I could see causing variance in games. A lot of late game variance as well. I mean, I've lost track of losing track of how many times there's been teams where, like late in games, where a team was getting smashed pregame and you saw a 2.5 point move, open the close, late week money has come in on that team. And it's either been just an absolute no doubt wire to wire loser, or it's a tight game in the fourth quarter where you're just kind of programmed as a bettor to be like, okay, here comes the drive. And that money that came in that just wrecked the market is going to be validated. And it's like, no, turn over the other way. And the other team scored 14 points to finish and they won by 26. And you're like, what happened? How did that happen? There's been so many games like that all season long. And I think that along with so many bettors like myself too, when you're looking at a lot of the post-game box scores and the recaps, and you see teams that had big success rate advantage, big net yards per play advantage, things like that, and then like lost by 30. You're like, what happened there? Like there's been a handful of those as well this year that have been unique as well. So a lot of that, I think, maybe shares with some of that sentiment you're saying too, but that's just things that I've observed. Give us your 3 most likely champs in order. Okay. Chiefs 1, Ravens 2, Bills 2B. I think the AFC is ahead of the NFC. So I'd stack those 3 AFC teams. That's maybe a bit of a cop-out because I'm guaranteed to have one in the Super Bowl, but I think it's the 3 AFC teams, then it's Detroit, and then it's Philadelphia in the rankings. Any other questions before we go? 58 minutes, 4 games, recaps, talk, everything. Appreciate everybody for stopping by. Again, the subscribe button is down below. We'll do a Wednesday night live stream. Tentatively planned. We'll see how Wednesday pans out. But I think Wednesday night is a good time to do it, probably at like the 7 p.m. Eastern range. If you hit the subscribe button down below, you'll get the notification. If you don't think you're subscribed, you can still hit it. If there is a thumbs up button, you can hit that as well. If you're already subscribed to, would appreciate it if you hit the thumbs up or subscribe before you head out. Final quick questions. Scott Cobe says, did you talk about short rest for Washington? Saturday night to Sunday night, 6 days. Could matter as well as you get the max versus min rest. Don't know necessarily how to price that effectively. And Ken is saying, how does Lions Commanders not go over 55.5? So that is, in fact, the total. I missed that in the chat, guys. Pardon me. I did catch the 8.5. I would say the most likely path that it is stopped and prevented from going over 55.5 is that you're going to get 4th down gambles like crazy. And so if you get long drives, like we saw at the end of the game against the Bucs, you get that 4th down stop, the gamble doesn't go that way. You're going to have that potential on both sides, honestly, where you get long 75, 80-yard drives that end up with 0 rather than 3 or 7. That's certainly a potential of things to happen quite a bit as well. Mike A., thank you for another good stream. Best of luck, everybody cashing tickets this upcoming weekend. Same to you as well. If there was a positive to take away amid losing on the service over, hopefully somebody out there had the Ty Johnson props that we were talking about, whether you took the touchdown at 7-1 or the receiving yards. The Joe Mixon stuff was okay as well. So there were some decent prop mentions as well last week that maybe folks picked up on in the stream. On the Wednesday stream, we'll talk about some more matchups and look at that as well. So there's plenty to discuss from these games that come up. Rodolfo's, he's got the beers and the carne asada. Well, you tell me where to go. I'll be there in an hour if it's within driving distance. Hopefully you've got some beers on ice as well, if you've got those too. Just give me the address, Rodolfo. I'll be there. All right. That's it for me, guys. Enjoy your Sunday night. If you're listening on the pod, have a fantastic Monday. 7 games to go in the regular season. Thanks, everybody, for stopping by. We'll chat with you again on Wednesday to wrap up the podcast for Divisional Weekend. See you then.